Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief for Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this sixth and final episode in a series on creating resilient supply chains through IT innovation, presented by Deloitte Consulting. The topic today is supply chain enterprise planning, supply chain evolution in an uncertain environment. One quick note, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, global supply chain shifts and macro trends in the industry are creating opportunities to assess current operations and make strategic pivots as companies struggle to prepare for future disruptions. There are any number of possible solutions, but it's becoming increasingly important to look beyond the supply chain to identify innovative ways to evolve the workplace, anticipate and meet customers' desires, and build a more profitable route to market. So today, we're going to hear some insights on how organizations can anticipate and act on fast evolving consumer needs through digital transformation and increased collaboration across the supply chain. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Ryan Geiger is Senior Manager, Supply Chain Network Operations with Deloitte Consulting, LLP. Ryan has 10 years of experience as a supply chain leader for retail and consumer goods clients. Throughout his consulting career, he has partnered with clients on post-M&A operational strategies that reshaped product flow, distribution networks, and inventory strategies. Kevin Mahoney is Managing Director of Supply Chain Network Operations with Deloitte Consulting, LLP. Kevin has 15 years of experience as a strategic operations and finance executive. He has led large-scale transformation initiatives with a focus on integrated business planning, omni-channel fulfillment, sourcing and procurement, sales and inventory planning, and network optimization. So with that, I want to pass it off to Kevin Mahoney for the presentation. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Bob. Excited to be here today. So I want to ask everyone the question, what if your supply chain problem isn't your supply chain? Digital supply chains are something that we've been discussing for years preceding COVID. Questions of how can we continuously incorporate digital information into an operation that was physical in nature, especially when supply chains involve several external components to get products from one place to another. When COVID became front and center in many organizations, as professionals in this space, no one could have planned for this type of disruption. What we experienced in COVID wasn't anything as supply chain professionals we haven't dealt with before. Supplier disruptions and delays impacting production, lack of capacity on transportation, freight movements, shortages in supply, significant variability in our demand, and with all of that, challenges in the labor market and finding the people we needed to execute. The main difference is that COVID caused us to face all of these challenges simultaneously and on a global scale, which, as we all know, had not been done before. Going to university, I went to Penn State, and I went in with a focus on business, and I was unclear what I'd do after that. So when I met with my advisor, she asked me one simple question. Do you like solving puzzles? I said, sure, puzzles are fun. I do Sudoku, I do this. But I didn't know why she asked me that. And what she said was, I think you're going to love our business logistics program. You're going to get to solve puzzles for the rest of your life. And that's what we do. So as supply chain leaders, we individually solve puzzles. And to this point, within the supply chain, we've always just figured it out. But the shift that has happened as a result and has caused us to maybe think about this a little bit different and not just solve our problems within the supply chain, but as an organization, people started asking the question, instead of supply chain solve the problem, how can we help you to solve that problem? And so Over the past few years, as supply chain leaders, I'm sure many of you on the phone have been stuck in a daily firefight, just trying to get products out the door. It's not until recently that collectively our supply chain leaders have had a chance to step back, breathe. And I'm not going to say relax, but really think about what were the day-to-day challenges that we had faced? What were the real drivers to these challenges? And, and what needs to change? One of the common things that we continue to hear is, I'm not going to relive what we just went through over the past few years. And so that's highlighted the challenges that supply chains had dealt with, from lack of tools, lack of resources and skilled resources, lack of data, and the data we needed to truly make strategic decisions. But more than anything, it's caused leadership at executive levels to rethink supply chain and our overall needs, especially now coming out of the past few years where we realize the data availability from internal and external sources have grown exponentially. And I think we all know that the amount of data has outgrown Excel's capabilities. The data we're receiving from suppliers, from 3PLs, vendors, and more than anything, customers, is more information than we've ever seen before. With that data comes increased levels of security requirements from an enterprise level, but also a different set of expectations. And one of the key emerging expectations is sustainability, which has become more than just a buzzword, but an expectation. And more than an expectation, a regulation, especially as we think globally, some of our partners in the EU and APAC. What we used to do to serve customers and solve customers' needs was to solve it with inventory. And I think we've all learned that is not a sustainable solution. You cannot solve our entire supply chain problems by increasing inventory levels. And that speed is becoming paramount. And speed as it relates to planning and execution, connectivity, responsiveness, information sharing in regards to operational relationships have become pivotal. We've conditioned our partners, our customers, and we've reset their expectations. The challenge there is that in many cases, to solve our problems, we've worked outside of systems. We've created one-off solutions, and they've become a struggle to now incorporate into our technology and execute at scale. And it's causing us to fundamentally rethink how we serve the supply chain, how we serve our customers, and how we serve our industries. What that's leading to is change and transformation. And planning and enterprise planning is at the heart of that. The amount of sheer connectivity, responsiveness, and decision-making that happens across the enterprise. Adoptions are necessary, and organizations are no longer optimizing supply chain in pockets, whether it be lean manufacturing, throughput optimization, last mile delivery, but they're optimizing for the end-to-end value chain. They're rethinking optimization and what that means for the enterprise. If you've worked with me before in any capacity, you've probably heard me say that supply chains are the most collaborative function in an organization. With the simple fact, they deal with the most constraints to execute across the business. Cross-functional touch points throughout this journey have shown us those are the biggest breakdowns in an organization. Collaboration between finance, commercial, sales, merchandising. The connection points throughout the value chain are also the points of breakdown and the bottlenecks that we're facing that have slowed down our operations and execution. Connectivity as a whole is critical. And it highlighted to us, especially during COVID, the difference between the leaders and the laggards in this space. It was on full display. For any of my friends in the CPG world, if you think of your relationship with Amazon, their responsiveness, because of the connected environment in which they operate with, was weeks faster than some of their competitors on what they need from their partners and suppliers, setting that expectation and writing POs within days. But not only that, all the way downstream to their customers and consumers like you and I, to say, I no longer am going to deliver in 2 days, but this is our new delivery date, and resetting those expectations, knowing that in that fully connected environment, I was able to respond and reset expectations to deliver on our customer and consumer needs, from, again, upstream writing a PO to downstream and delivering on that promise. Cross-functional connectivity and decision-making is critical. There's a transformational shift underway, and many of our leaders are asking a similar question, but with one distinction. The ask is no longer, it's no longer what is the ask of the business, but what is the need of the business? And how can we make that happen across the end-to-end value chain? Ryan Geiger is going to go through more detail on how clients are looking at and addressing this journey and navigating through it at this time. Bob.
We'll bring a slide back to our message here in a moment. Take us back to, there we go. Thank you very much. Good data helps drive supply chains forward. At Saddle Creek Logistics Services, we take a solutions-based, data-driven approach to solving your logistics challenges. We can help you capture key data points, interpret them effectively in order to guide operational decisions. In addition to good data, we also leverage advanced operational methods and powerful technologies to ensure peak performance for your supply chain. Learn more at sclogistics.com.
Thanks, Saddle Creek. Hi, everyone. Ryan Geiger. Pleasure to meet you. And thanks, Kevin, for kind of kicking us off and describing kind of the intro into what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis within our clients. The whole notion of what we're discussing today was born out of a hypothesis, as Kevin mentioned, of what if your supply chain problem isn't actually your supply chain? And while a lot of this content focuses heavily on what we're seeing within retail, it has a massive cross-industry application. If you think about industries like life sciences, consumer products, high tech, all of these types of things can be directly applied to those industries, and we'll hit on some of those as I walk through this framework today. When we thought about a framework to dissect and break down this hypothesis, we said that asking this question is actually fundamentally changing the DNA of our retailers' supply chains and other industries for that matter as well. The function is actually thinking about things in a completely different manner. And if we hit on the first one here, it's that more and more organizations are taking a consumer-first approach. When we approach many of our retailers and consumer products companies now, they're no longer thinking about the supply chains that were constructed for scale and for efficiency that look at a left to right linear flow. They're actually working their way backwards. And I thought it was very interesting that just today, actually, General Mills announced that combination of truly obsessing over the consumer and analytics has led to an increase in their digital sales channel of over 24% year over year. And I think what we're seeing here is that industries and clients of ours who are investing in the consumer first are saying, how do I structure my cross-functional organization to enable the customer promise? Another perfect example of this is Kevin and I were at one of our clients, and during our time with a client and doing the planning transformation, a very popular Netflix series came out. And one of the footwear on that Netflix series caused a 6,000% increase in a specific piece of footwear. And the question becomes, how does any organization deal with that type of use case? When you think about, again, 45 to 60-day lead times, you think about the ability for your multi-channel direct-to-consumer and wholesale environment reprioritizing based on that kind of sell-through. And so it all is starting to work its way backwards from the consumer. Another really interesting use case on this one is I was working with a consumer products company on hosting a digital transformation workshop for customer-facing supply chain. And the notion of a retailer working very closely with consumer products companies isn't new, But what is new is the adoption of data and analytics to truly move from mass to micro. And what I mean by this is that grocers, as an example, are getting really, really smart about what are their micro customer segments and how do we actually service those micro customer segments. Perfect example is Kroger is doing movie night, and they're no longer thinking about how do I set up my 95 to 150 departments, but how do I actually tailor what I assort in my stores from a very micro customer segment approach. If you can imagine, then that works its way backwards and permeates all throughout the organization, again, changing the DNA of what we're seeing. It changes how trade integrates with demand planning and forecasting. It integrates with how you actually enable flow to tailor your customer deliveries and your distribution centers to enable those micro segments from actually becoming a realization. If I move on to the next one, Kevin hit on it really well, which is how do we balance efficiency and resiliency? And what I would say with this one is that more and more organizations are viewing this as much more than how do I structure my network and do things like a network strategy. They're looking and being very purposeful with tailoring their investments the next 5 to 10 years and mechanizing and automating their DCs. They're looking at things like postponement strategies and late stage differentiation much differently. And they're trying to say, how do I align my channel strategy, which is continuing to evolve? Again, if you think about a consumer products company, their channel strategy looks very different than it looked 5 to 10 years ago. And the concept of marketplaces and the concept of direct to consumer and the concept of, again, these micro assortments at big grocers like a Walmart or a Kroger really change the way that things like inventory positions need to be placed. And again, we're seeing that emphasis on it can't just be redundant inventory across your entire network. It has to be a very, very hyper localized placement of inventory, again, to balance efficiency and resiliency. The other thing I would say too, that COVID is certainly highlighted, but COVID as a pandemic was just the start of it. It seemed like dominoes just kept falling. My wife at the time was a supply planner for a huge paint and coatings company. And a lot of their raw materials manufacturing was in Texas during the deep freeze. That put many coatings and resources companies behind 6 to 12 months on raw materials and associated lead times. The Suez Canal, the geopolitical instability, all of those types of use cases created the impetus for organizations to really invest a lot of time and energy and money into stratifying their partners that they work with and saying, if I can tackle the Pareto of my tier 1 and my tier 2 suppliers, and if I can do, let's say, a light constraint-based plan for them, even though they don't control the capacity that might either be dedicated or shared, that partner system connectivity is moving way beyond things like ASN compliance and having that visibility. And it's moving into how do I take my most strategic and important partners that I'm working with to make sure that we have connectivity across the entire go-to-market. The other piece too is, and Kevin hit on this a ton up front, is how do you actually break down supply chains that were built around legacy structures, legacy on-prem data flows, and lack of system connectivity? And how do you actually break this down and do this differently? And this has become so important to Deloitte as a practice and getting this right, that we actually created a strategic growth opportunity and platform within our human capital practice to partner with supply chain on this exact issue. And the concept of changing your supply chain in micro bits is actually starting to flip on its head a little bit on this as well too, for what we're calling zero-based organizational design. And when you take a digital transformation agenda that has a 4 to 5 to 6 year horizon, and you purposely plan for, if I didn't have the legacy baggage with the way we're organized today, and if I didn't have the misaligned incentives between cross-functional organizations, how would we actually operate? And how would we actually look as an organization? And what I would say is that executives at the highest level are now focusing on this. And it's because supply chain's importance is essentially being inverted and flipped on its head from a cost center to essentially a profit and sales enabler. And if you again think about the things that happened during COVID and what that meant, it meant that supply chain's been elevated. In the retail and supply chain space, I can probably count on each hand each week how many times I get either from the retail brew or from other newsletters that supply chain chief operating officers are being elevated. They're either being created organically or they're being brought in externally from industry as a new role. And so supply chain's getting a seat at the table because the notion of lost sales and the notion of distressed inventory, we see this just time and time again. It's elevated now to a point where the functions are basically now incented to work together to enable things like OTIF and on-shelf availability. The next one's pretty near and dear to my heart. I was at a retailer in the 2017 to 2019 timeframe who was just on the cusp of really moving from a project and an IT-led organization to a product-driven organization. And they brought in one of the product bootcamp organizations out of California, and they really did an awesome job of evolving their talent pool and their workforce to ramp up to cloud-first SaaS-based solutions. And the reality is that the supply chain technologies that all of us touch today look very different than the rigid monolithic solutions that something like an ERP is, where it's tied to a financial workflow and it's tied to system triggers that have to occur from a compliance standpoint. The supply chain solutions that we have are very open source. They're very flexible. They have a lot of room for configurability. You can add analytics to it, both in-house, you can do it out of house with external drivers. And all of those things mean that if you don't have a product organization stood up to have intake prioritization, to have things like looking at the business and the capability as a whole and working with a vendor's roadmap, it's really hard to do a lot of things that we've already mentioned. If you can sit and look at the overall purview of your end-to-end supply chain, or if you can look at specific functions like customer-facing supply chain in the workshop we were in, you can start to break down the problem and say, where are the areas of most need? And as an example of where this could lead to, one of the retailers we were working with was really obsessing over how do they increase OTIF and how do they do a root cause of OTIF and the concerns that it has, and then build products around that. And so a perfect example of that is one of the biggest root causes of OTIF is dock scheduling and dock schedule availability, and also the changes to that. And so this retailer put a lot of time and investment and energy into working with its top suppliers to say, we can automate dock scheduling. And if things change, we can also trigger the rescheduling of docs as well too. And so again, that happens when you have an evergreen capability stood up within your organization that isn't business and isn't operations, who should be making the strategic trade-off based decisions and aligning to sales and to finance and to merchandising. And it isn't IT, who's really good with how to own, run, sustain an overall solution and tech stack, and do things like manage a data lake. It's that bridge between the two that can really help with this. The final piece is the evolution of workforce. And on client conversations where Kevin and I get to approach it together, one of my favorite questions that he usually asks during the conversations is, have you recently taken a look at what your organization's job postings look like for supply chain roles, especially ones that sit in corporate and they sit in planning? And if you look at the qualifications and the requirements for those roles, do those qualifications reflect the evolution that digital transformation is actually bringing about in the workforce? More times than not, what I would say, when we look at these job postings routinely, they do not. And if you're purposeful about how you structure your digital transformation agenda, and if you have a really strong partner within your human resources group, there is a way to plan for the talent succession processes. This is by no means an easy process, but where this usually starts is breaking down in the beginning of these digital transformations in specific charters you have, whether it be within planning or within logistics or within product development. Where it starts is being really critical about what can be automated. A lot of decisions now with technology, with different forecasting models, with different analytics, with AI and ML, they actually can be automated. And it's taking, how do you elevate those tasks that are repetitive, that can be done in a way that can be done by a machine instead of by a person? And how do you elevate those to have an organization align skills and resources to basically fine tune what's being done by a machine, and then have humans do the coordination among cross-functional parties and to make the hard decisions and the trade-offs that aren't just going to come out on, a dashboard. Kevin hit on this a lot, and I think I've been hitting on this throughout kind of the previous framework as well too, but supply chain is now at the complete center of what our retailers are looking at from a business decision. It isn't just about optimizing for one area anymore. And in a lot of cases, it's being elevated to things like shareholder and investment summary calls. One of our clients we've been working with, they had a pretty bad air freight problem, and air freight is looked at essentially could be looked at as a systemic problem of how do you work with all of your cross-functional parties to manage lead times, to manage how you work with product development, to make sure that you have the right go-to-market stage gates, to make sure that you have multiple different modes of transportation to be able to plan against. And what we're seeing the intake process come from specific use cases or specific cost aggravations, then create kind of these discussions to say, if you were to break down the top 5 to 6 use cases across your go-to-market, where are you actually seeing areas of breakdown within your organization, breakdown within decision-making, and then breakdown with your overall data flows? And so all that being said, the main point we want to hit on here is that consumers are changing a ton because of their use of digital technology and their expectations around those. It's no longer just Amazon. I was on a cosmetics personalization webinar that was hosted within our practice by one of the companies that's a D2C startup. And the notion of a consumer going out and getting 6 or 7 different pieces of cosmetics in favor of putting in their preferences, taking a picture of their skin tone, and then getting a kit mailed to them each and every couple months for their makeup, that kind of expectation now is permeating through all sorts of purchasing behaviors. And again, supply chains that were built for scale and speed and efficiency don't tend to work really well with those types of use cases, but that's head on what our consumers are looking for out of organizations that interact directly with the consumer. The other thing I would say too is that the labor market has placed a ton of concern and emphasis, especially on labor-heavy industries. Retail and grocery is a perfect example. With the use cases I was just mentioning on digital, the notion of digital picking within our brick and mortar retailer stores is becoming a big deal. And we were recently at a regional grocery chain, and this regional grocery chain had pretty decent on-shelf availability as a metric and as a corporate metric that they were viewing. But in actuality, when we did store visits, that wasn't the case. And the store visits led us to conclusions and hypotheses that on-shelf availability and the quality of actually how on-shelf availability was done was actually a function, or at least highly contributed by a tight labor market. And part of that was because the digital picking that now goes on within a grocery store, in some stores for grocery, is eclipsing 15 or 20%, depending on what geography you're in. And so how shelves are being faced and how they're stocked and restocked, digital is having an impact on that too, because not all groceries come from an Ocado shed or from a dark store. They're coming from the actual physical grocery stores as well. The final thing too is that all of this has to be thought of differently. And so I brought up the notion of a zero-based organizational design. And the reality is that we can't get out of firefighting mode if we don't elevate supply chain across these different functions in different way. And so many conversations recently have gotten to, how do we take something like the notion of a network planner, and how does a network planner ensure a cross-functional metric? And so in this case, it could be OTIF. But there's many other applications to that, which suggest if you take your functions and if you elevate certain roles and you incent with shared metrics, there's a way to get around tying together multiple parties of the ecosystem in a more kind of cohesive way. I'm not going to go through these ones too much because I'm excited for us to kind of open it up for Q&A as well too. But what I would say is there's some tangible questions that, as you sit in your seat within supply chain and as you think about prompting the change that's ahead of you, you can start to use. And so within this framework, if you think about becoming very consumer centric, the first question is the way we organized and is the way that we work meeting the end customer promise? And do we work backwards from that customer promise? You know, a perfect example is a lot of our specialty apparel and footwear that still operate within a heavy amount of wholesale, they still don't actually do sell in and sell out forecasting. And the richness of what can be received from a wholesaler's POS data isn't leveraged because of all of the systemic issues that Kevin mentioned earlier. And so that's one example of provoking and saying, how can we look at under and overperforming SKUs if we don't do sell in and sell out forecasting, if we don't look at what our key wholesalers are doing in a meaningful way during that S&OE type cycle? The next thing is the right structure in place? It might not be called product, and that's okay. Is the right structure in place to intake different business needs, prioritize those business needs, and then start to place a value on them so that there can be a gatekeeper and an evergreen owner within the organization to actually evolve the tech landscape and the tools that your business is equipped with as a supply chain? What we're seeing more and more is that instead of an organization solely hiring out an entire organization to do product, they're taking some of the digital first visionary type thinkers out of their day-to-day business roles. And they're saying, we view you as someone who can take a digital transformation agenda and start to unlock value in the organization. And they put folks in that role and they stand up that organization with a leadership mandate in such a way that can actually allow them the purview, and they already have the respect as an operator to be able to make that evergreen change and also push back on the business on short-term needs for long-term transformations. I've already hit on the third one quite a bit here, but what I would say is that organizations are going back to the basics on this one. And what I mean by that is they're breaking down their value chain and they're saying, where do we have key metrics like OTIF, like on-shelf availability, like case fill rate, like cost to serve? And how do we incent all the different parties within the organization to actually have a more profitable and a more service and customer or consumer-faced value chain? And what ends up happening is digital transformation items come out of that, and cross-functional kind of changes come out of that as well too. The next one here is probably just been felt by everyone, but how do you actually take the multiple parties within your supply chain and do things like a strategic and operational procurement analysis? One of the specialty apparel and footwear retailers we've worked with recently had a lot of issues with a couple key components within their supply chain. One of them was YKK zippers, and almost every piece of apparel we have uses a YKK zipper. And the question becomes, how do you do both strategic raw materials planning and forecasting from some of your T2 vendors for hard to find or sole source materials like Gore-Tex, like YKK zippers? And how do you pair the upfront sourcing and how you set up your value chain with some of your downstream type functions and your fulfillment? And so if I expand on that further, I brought up the notion of tying your channel strategy to how you set up your network. And so you might look out at your channel growth strategy with your business partners and say, we're going to grow digital and we're going to grow marketplaces within our organization 25 to 50%. If we blow that down to a unit level, and if we look at that across our DCs, this is going to create the need for micro fulfillment. And this is going to create the need for automated receiving and AGVs within our warehouses and the need to mechanize and automate our warehouses. And so that then creates a discussion with, do we strategically partner with a 3PL that can do this, or do we actually do this in-house? And so those are the types of questions that we're seeing that we're helping our clients with as well on the efficiency and resiliency. And it's because clients are trying to get creative with the glut of inventory that they've had to purge within their networks, especially from a retailer side. The other piece we're seeing, and I hit on it a little bit too, is how do you really create connectivity and responsiveness and agility within your partners? And what I would say for this one is that it really takes looking at the overall connectivity use cases and then investing in the right time, resources, and energy to make that connectivity worth it. And it isn't about converting all of your suppliers over to 99.5% EDI 856 ASN compliance, but rather it's looking at how do I operate on the whole and the Pareto, and then I can manage the exceptions on the margins. And so we're seeing this throughout all the value chain. We're seeing this within transportation and within last mile. We're seeing this within how we work with 3PL partners and their labor availability. And then we're seeing it again with our supplier bases and internal manufacturing with things like Smart Factory. The final piece is too is on the evolution of the workforce. I've already hit on a little bit, but is there a transition plan in place? And so if you're sitting in a VP role, and if you're saying, I can look out and I'm part of the talent reviews, I know the segmentation of my workforce, I know who's the really solid performers, and they're going to be in their roles within planning, but I also see that there's a couple folks who can really, really step up and elevate and be a cross-functional role. There should be a transition plan in place to actually evolve your workforce to tie into the digital transformation agendas. And so we'll leave this as an artifact as well too, because I'd love to get to the Q&A portion. But what I would say is that we wanted to provide some ways and tactics to actually start to go after this question of tackling the supply chain problem, not actually being supply chain. And from these 6 different pieces within the framework, what I would say is that it all boils down to how do I work within the confines of a consumer-driven supply chain that uses data and analytics. It says, how do I tie digital transformation agenda to automating specific tasks and then managing to the strategic decision-making. And then it says, how do I work with all of the parties across my ecosystem to be able to make sure that I'm evaluating for cross-functional metrics that really look to try to optimize the end-to-end value chain. All
well,
right.
thank you very much for that, Ryan. Great presentation, great insights. I want to bring Kevin back too for the panel discussion portion of our presentation, and then we'll get right into audience questions. And by the way, audience, you keep on submitting those questions by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll of course get to as many of them as we can, time permitting. But I want to start with a question for Kevin. Kevin, you opened up with a very provocative statement. You said the supply chain problem may not be the supply chain. What have you seen as the general feedback coming from that idea, that concept?
I think, as I said earlier, COVID definitely highlighted this supply chain. COVID made supply chain the song of the summer, right? Where everyone all of a sudden knew what it was, knew what supply chain did, but also didn't realize what we had to go through to bring a product to a end customer, consumer, final destination. I think the provocative question was intended to open eyes and open discussions that we haven't had before. When you think of, like I started to say, finance operates on the fiscal calendar and they tell you a number. And then as a planner, that's not always how things work. It's not always aligned. We may have an 18-month out planning cycle. So I think it's really started to open eyes, open discussions, and understand where those points of collaboration and connectivity are. More than anything, I think it's also highlighted the fact that across organizations, we don't speak the same language. Who speaks in dollars? Who speaks in units? Who speaks in? So it started to open discussions that not only lead to where are the process connection points, but what do we need to look at as far as metrics and KPIs that are holistic in nature and enterprise level, so that once we're operating to the same, KPIs, measures, now we've got shared incentives. So more than anything, I think, one, it's opened eyes to process breakdowns. It showed that organizationally there is misalignment, and we've started to move the needle on how can we move that alignment, first with KPIs, second with processes, and then how can we start to drive enhancements, automation, and connectivity through the technology. So it's been multifaceted and probably more than I expected to, but it's been a really interesting discussion, and not just with supply chain professionals, with others in the organization as well.
Thank you. Ryan, you were talking about a fundamental altering of retail supply chain's DNA. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by supply chain's DNA and how we in the supply chain can actually make corrective efforts.
Absolutely, Bob. The big thing here is this often provokes a question, who owns the customer and who enables the customer promise that makes or breaks a customer experience. And this can be said across high tech, this can be said across CPG, beverage, and fashion. And we've noticed a ton of upstream and downstream focus is being placed on how processes and systems and technology actually enable and work together to enable the customer promise. COVID, as Kevin mentioned, highlighted, but certainly all the other events after that, where those breakdowns are occurring. And in a lot of ways, what we're seeing is that the customer is being aligned more and more to the supply chain, and thus that's changing their DNA. So it's been a really, really fascinating time to be a supply chain professional and to work with our clients on this.
Thank you. Just real quickly, I want to talk about this idea of upskilling, trending in supply chain conversations and workforce redesign. Kevin, maybe you could elaborate just briefly on Deloitte's perspective of workforce future and how that concept might impact supply chains.
Absolutely. Ryan gave a little preview of one of my favorite activities, and I think anyone in this forum, if you were to go and pull your job description as any part of your supply chain organization, and then think of the leading organizations in the supply chain and pull that job description, they have evolved tremendously. And as an organization that maybe hasn't started or gone through any of the transformation, you will see Excel, PowerPoint, some mathematics skills, executive communication. When you look at the leading companies, you'll see data scientists with skills in R, Python, or SQL. As the transformation is undergoing in planning, the amount of information has grown exponentially. And the skill set that we need to manage that is no longer that Excel-based and communication-based individual. That's a part of it. The reality is we are going to move to more of an automated solution. We're going to leverage some AI, ML to take some of those non-value added decisions that we're making over and over and over again through meetings and discussions and make them a part of how we just do our day-to-day work. Where that other half of the job description is going to be is on strategic decision making. So again, data-driven, analytical, and strategic is kind of a big shift on what we're seeing, especially in the supply chain and planning space. And that shift towards being strategic, once we've started to drive automation and solutioning on decisions that are non-value add, what's left of that individual, or what that ask is of that individual, is how can I make a strategic impact for the business to drive sales, to impact my customer, or to solution for challenges that I'm facing day to day. So I think overall, we're going through a transformation in, how this supply chain is viewed, the technology, but more than anything, who we're going to need in that future state to manage the supply chain. And you can think of it in multiple, as our DCs and manufacturing and planning and transportation gets more automated, the skill set and the labor demands are going to shift as well. Ryan, I think anything you want to add in this realm?
Well, you know what, guys, I really think we're running out of time. I want to get right to audience Q&A. I want to bring our audience into this if we can at all possible, because we have a lot of questions. So if we could just move on, that would be great. Here again is the audience Q&A portion of our presentation. I want to direct this to Kevin very quickly. What do you think, Kevin, are the key differentiators of efficiency and agility in terms of meeting the end consumer promise?
So I think similar to the workforce change, we need to start to incorporate automation into our day-to-day processes. Think critically about the decisions we're making over and over again within our organization, and embed that agility or flexibility into the process. At what level and what granularity do we need data if we're looking 12 months out? At what point do we need to make key decisions that impact inventory volumes, flows? And can we automate some of these to focus on, again, the high value strategic decision-making process that gets us to market? Again, this will free up not only time for our individuals, but it'll allow us to think more about the trade-offs, the decisions, and different strategies that we want to address the market and grow with. So
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Ryan, I want to ask you this question coming in. You mentioned several new opportunities for retailers. Of these new opportunities, which, if any, are scalable across other industries and markets?
Absolutely, Bob. One of the things I mentioned is the shift from mass to micro. And certainly what we're seeing within retail and catering to micro segments can definitely be applied to other industries like food and beverage and even alcohol. And we have a perspective and a take that potentially alcohol could be that next frontier that's starting to look at micro segments of their customer bases much differently. And the question boils down to, when you have these micro segments, how do you work your way backwards to align all the different parties of your organization, whether it be trade and promotions, whether it be sales, whether it be marketing, and align those different parties to those micro segments. And so that aligning that is one thing, but then actually doing that within all of your executional and planning processes is another. And that's what is the cause for concern or the impetus for these digital transformation agendas, is to tailor to those micro segments, Bob.
Kevin, I want to ask you this. Do you see a high level of acceptance and buy-in for the concept of product-driven technology? And can you provide an example of this concept?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think what we've seen in the shift that many of you have probably gone through is an implementation methodology shift from your traditional waterfall to hybrid agile methodology. And there's a big component of that has a very positive impact to business users. As a business user, if you've gone through waterfall, you give them all your requirements, you show up 6 months later, here's our answer. In that hybrid agile, what we're seeing is adoption at every step of the way. And in that adoption, the business user is providing what they're looking for initially, and they're seeing the system over and over and over throughout the process while we get to testing and go live and implementation. What that does is create this level of not only adoption, but also accountability and ownership. So as we shift from that, from the traditional waterfall to hybrid agile, I think that helps this. And then when you pair that with, project to product mindset, it also allows them to know that adoption over time is something that's going to happen over time. And we're going to deliver programs with levels of capability that adopt over time and grow over time with additional releases, keeping the business engaged throughout. So I think when we shift from that waterfall to hybrid and project to product, I think the mentality is continued evolution and adoption, which as a business user is a great thing, because if I plan for the end state today, it's going to change before I get there. So being able to be flexible is going to be critical.
Ryan, people really are concerned about this concept of organizational silos. This question is, what are some other options that have proved successful to bridge those silos within legacy mindsets in the organization?
Yeah, Bob, it's a great question. And I hint at it a little bit during the portion of the slides, but what I would say is that it's really looking at cross-functional metrics and working their way backwards. And so I discussed things like ODIF, fill rate, on-shelf availability. And the question becomes can that be a launching off point to incent cross-functional collaboration and to, again, bridge those legacy silos? It's still very, very common, I would say, when we start our digital transformations in those journeys with our clients, they're just operating within the metrics that they're aligned to. And I don't blame our clients that we work with, because that's what they're incented on and that's what their performance is measured against. And the reality is, when you take the breakdowns that those cause when you operate in those silos, they get magnified and they get amplified. And a perfect example is as the adoption rate of digital and omni-channel reaches 20, 25, 30%, there starts to become a watermark on profitability. And that is something that, again, if you work your way backwards and if you think about the shipping and the lead times and click to ship rates and units per package and units per parcel, and then you think about reverse logistics cost, if all of those things aren't thought about holistically across your cross-functional silos, you get the exact thing that we get today with a lot of retailers who haven't thought of this, which is a higher cost to serve. And so that's just one practical example, I would say, Another method would be breaking down the what and how work gets done. And so I brought up the concept of a zero-based organizational design. But if you start a digital transformation agenda, and if you do proof of concepts with your providers you're going forward with, your business and your leadership will start to get a really good idea of what you can prioritize and what you can automate, again, as Kevin mentioned, versus what you'd have to do within a function or cross-functionally. And so looking at what and how work gets done when you start these kind of transformational agendas can really help you when you start this journey, Bob.
I think I'm going to direct this question to you as well, Ryan. This is talking about how you've mentioned several times the idea of the dynamism of consumer demand and preferences as a key supply chain impact. How can we better anticipate and predict to provide more stability in the supply chain?
This is really tough, especially with the labor market that we have today. I think everybody on this phone probably deals with a shortage in planning skills that can really help with this problem statement. And so that has led us to the conclusion that if you can automate decision-making that's rules-based and repetitive, as Kevin mentioned, that's where the effort and the investment has to be focused on. Because if you do that, what ends up happening is that you unlock the potential to really focus on tailoring to those dynamic consumer sentiments, working to figure out with your data scientists, like what are the true drivers that are changing that dynamic customer demand in real time. And then again, it's just provoking questions in the organization. Like if we actually can get our wholesalers' point of sale data and work our way backwards from the point of consumption, how can we meaningfully actually do that within our planning horizon? I think the final thing too is we both hit on a little bit too, is reaching up into your upstream vendor network and figuring out how do you actually work with them in a more repetitive and efficient manner to share that information, as opposed to let's just blindly cut purchase orders and hope that the vendor can do it. And so this is a couple practical examples for that, Bob.
Thank you. And by the way, we've been talking a lot in this presentation about OTIF, OTIF. Stands for on time in full, just to make sure everybody knows that. Real quickly, Kevin, the question, do you feel the concept of agile has become more of a quote unquote catchphrase? And how do we really leverage agile supply chain concepts to boost business efficiency and end-to-end integration within the organization?
Oh, so I will admit early on, I was not a firm believer in agile. I have since seen the light, and I've seen the value that it brings to an organization. Obviously, they're still focused on technology components, technology milestones, and that's critical, right, as we're implementing technology. But I think the value that Agile has really unlocked is how much the business users really start to understand the tools, the technology, and trust, which is a huge component of adoption, those tools and technology, because they're along for the journey. There's no longer a feeling of this is not what I asked for, this is being done to me, but more of I've had a part in building this together. And so it's become more about integrating with the business early, often, and then adoption, but adoption with ongoing improvement and sustaining the solution, which I think businesses make these investments. It's not going to be the tool itself that drives a ton of value. It's the users driving the value, using the tool, and then using the capabilities that it provides. So again, I'm a firm believer because of the business benefit and what it brings to the table as far as adoption and ongoing, improvement.
Excellent point. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for answering all those great questions and for your insights all through the presentation. Unfortunately, I have to say, we are just about out of time. We have time for just one more question, and I'm going to direct it to Kevin. Kevin, what is one key takeaway for the audience today?
One key takeaway: change is probably the best and the worst thing in life. And until we retire, it's part of our professional lives. So as we think about the evolution of supply chain and we think about the evolution of planning, stay focused on three things. One, stay focused on the future. You can't plan for today's customer knowing that multi-year transformations, there's going to be a lot of change ahead of us. The customer of 3 years ago is not the customer of today. Flexibility is going to be the only constant. Maintaining flexibility in your thinking and how you're solving the problem and what you're striving towards is key. And as I said a few times, and a huge believer in this, adoption is ongoing, whether it's adoption, the vision, the customer, the talent pool, the supply chain. Make sure your transformation is going to be resilient, and you're going to be able to drive adoption. And really, as you consider this, think about your job. Think about where do you or where does your organization spend most of its time? And are you creating value that impacts your customer? And if not, are you ready to address those changes so you can have a bigger, more strategic impact? We've talked about eliminating non-value added. If you eliminate non-value added, you're adding value. So focus on that and where you can make an impact.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. And thank you both, Kevin Mahoney and Ryan Geiger, for that great presentation. Some really good insights for companies to take away in their efforts to improve their supply chains going forward. So thank you. And thank you, audience, as well, for your participation and your questions. Any questions we didn't get to, by the way, I'm sure that our speakers would be only too happy to answer them offline. I want to draw your attention for more information to this white paper from Deloitte US called Looking Beyond the Retail Supply Chain. There is a URL. Access it. Don't worry about having to differently. That URL that will be sent to all attendees of this webinar, but definitely take a look. Great more information there for you. So also, I do want to draw your attention to, this is, again, as I said, the 6th episode in a 6-part series on creating resilient supply chains through IT innovation presented by Deloitte Consulting. Those first 5 episodes, and indeed this one going forward too, can all be accessed on the Supply Chain Brain YouTube channel. So go there and you'll find all those episodes. And if you missed any, be sure and watch them, because it's a great series and a lot of educational insights into that. Finally, once again, I do want to thank our speakers, Kevin Mahoney, Ryan Geiger, audience as well. Thank you so much for your attendance, and everybody, have a great day.